A boy sits across from the man who raised him, the man who trained him, the man who told him what he was worth and what the world owed him. And the man drives a blade through his chest. The boy does not fight back. He has already decided what this moment means and what it is going to cost, and the cost is everything, and he pays it without looking away. That is one afternoon in the middle of Attack on Titan's run, and the show kept writing afternoons exactly like it. Quiet and then suddenly total, devastating in the specific way of things that have been building across years before anyone sees them arrive. A son reports his parents to the people who will destroy them. A father locks the truth in a basement and dies before he finds the right moment to share it. A soldier turns to the person beside him on top of a wall and confesses, almost casually, that he has been the enemy the entire time. Tonight is a slow walk through every betrayal this series ever built, from the ones that broke characters apart to the ones that broke the world itself. Welcome to Annie Brain. Let's get started. Section 1. Annie, Reiner, and Bertolt. The wolves among sheep. There is something almost peaceful about the early days of Attack on Titan. Not peaceful in the sense that the world is safe, because it clearly is not. Giant creatures roam the land outside enormous walls, and the people inside those walls have built entire lives around the assumption that the walls will hold. But peaceful in the sense that the story, at least in its earliest chapters, has a clear shape. There are titans and there are humans. There are enemies and there are allies. The people standing beside Eren Yeager in training, the people eating together and complaining about gear and sleeping in the same dormitories, are unambiguously on the same side. That clarity is part of what makes the earliest parts of the story so easy to settle in. The world is dangerous, but it is at least legible. That legibility was a lie. It did not feel like a lie at the time. Reiner Braun showed up as exactly the kind of person a story like this needs. He was broad-shouldered and reliable, the sort of person who made those around him feel steadier just by being present. He passed his training with high mark. He carried himself with the seriousness of someone who had already decided what he was willing to die for. When things went wrong, Reiner was the person people looked to. He was not the best fighter in the group, that title usually went to others, but he was the one who felt most like a soldier in the truest sense of the word. Dependable, present, committed. Eren looked up to him. Others followed his lead, and Reiner seemed to mean it, all of it, every moment of camaraderie and every act of loyalty. Bertolt Hoover, standing beside him, was almost the opposite in temperament. Where Reiner was warm and assured, Bertolt was quiet and slightly awkward, always a step behind in conversations, always looking like he was waiting for the moment to pass. He was gifted, ranked very high in training, but he carried himself like someone who found the world slightly too loud. He and Reiner were inseparable. They moved through the story as a pair, and that pairing created a sense of completeness. The extrovert and the introvert, the leader and the follower, the soldier and the reluctant soldier. Together, they felt like real people with real histories and real reasons for being exactly where they were. Annie Leonhardt was a different kind of presence entirely. She did not try to be liked, and she did not try to be disliked. She simply existed within the group at a slight remove from everyone else, as if she had decided very early on that closeness was not worth the cost. She ranked fourth in training. She was exceptional with her fists, with her swords, with every form of combat that was asked of her. She had a style of fighting that felt distinctly her own, and she had on occasion taught that style to others. She taught it to Eren, in fact, in the kind of detail that only someone who genuinely understood what they were doing could offer. But she held people at a distance, and most people read that distance as coldness. She was not unfriendly, exactly. She just did not go out of her way to connect. These three people, Annie, Reiner, and Bertolt, trained alongside Eren and Mikasa and Armin and all the others in the 104th Cadet Corps. They shared meals and drills and long, exhausting days on the equipment. They became, by every outward measure, part of the same group. And that belonging was the most precise deception Attack on Titan would ever construct, because Annie had been selected as one of Marley's warriors. She had been given the power of the female Titan and sent across the ocean with a mission that was not ambiguous and not complicated. Find the founding Titan, retrieve it, bring it back to Marley, and everything that needed to be destroyed along the way was an acceptable cost of doing that. Reiner carried the power of the armored Titan. Bertolt carried the power of the colossal Titan. They had come to Paradise Island together to tear the world inside the walls open, and they had done exactly that on the first day of the story. It was Bertolt who broke down Wall Maria as the colossal Titan that is established almost immediately. A massive shape appearing at the top of the wall, steam pouring off the skin, a kick that sends the gate flying inward in a cloud of debris. And it was Reiner who breached Wall Maria at the Shiganshina gate as the armored Titan, allowing Titans to pour through into the district where Eren and Mikasa and their family lived. Eren's mother was among those who died that day. She was caught by a Titan while her children watched. That moment is the wound the entire story grows from, the thing Eren cannot stop carrying, the loss that becomes fuel, and then obsession, and then something far darker. The two people responsible for that day were in training alongside him within a few years, smiling at him over meals and telling him to keep going when things got. This is the part of Annie, Reiner, and Bertolt's story that earns its weight before any reveal is even made. the camera does not tip its hand. The story does not leave obvious markers asking the audience to look more closely. The three of them are simply there, in the group, doing the things soldiers do, and the audience has no particular reason to look at them differently from anyone else. That is an unusual creative decision in a medium where dramatic irony is common currency. Most stories would give the viewer something to hold on to, a knowing look, a moment of private reflection that hints at a hidden self. Attack on Titan largely refuses to do this in its first season. Annie, Reiner, and Bertolt are presented as what they pretend to be, and the audience is taken in exactly as thoroughly as the characters they are deceiving. Annie's cover began to unravel first. During the 57th Exterior Expedition Beyond the Walls in Season 1, a Titan appeared that moved with startling intelligence. It sought out specific people. It called other Titans to its location with a scream. It protected its nape, the one point of vulnerability all Titans share, with a kind of deliberate precision that mindless Titans do not possess. Armin, watching from a close position when the female Titan stopped and looked directly at him rather than eating him, began turning something over in his mind. The female Titan had spared him specifically. She had pulled back her hood to get a clear view of his face, and she had continued hunting, as if she knew exactly who she was looking for and who was not worth her time. The mercy was not random. The recognition was not an accident. Armin was someone she knew. That observation sat with him. He did not have a conclusion yet, only a feeling that the Titan was operating on knowledge it should not have, knowledge that could only come from being inside the walls and among the people who lived there. He turned it over carefully, across multiple episodes, looking for what fit and what did not. By the time the Survey Corps returned to the walls after suffering significant losses during that expedition, Armin had a name. He kept it mostly to himself and to Eren and Mikasa, who found the idea almost too large to hold in their heads. The confirmation came in the final episodes of Season 1, in the Stohes district. Armin approached Annie directly, asking for her help with what was framed as a quiet escape plan. Annie hesitated, but she agreed. She was led toward an underground tunnel, and it was there that she stopped. She would not go underground. The tunnel would trap her Titanfall, and in that refusal, in that single act of self-preservation that broke the cover story she had maintained for years, everything became undeniable. Armin looked at her and said what he had spent weeks being afraid to say. She was the female Titan. She had been among them the entire time. She had killed Survey Corps soldiers with a violence she had managed to keep entirely separate from the version of herself that ate dinner with them. What Annie did in that moment was remarkable in a quiet way. She did not try to run. She did not try to talk her way out. She smiled. The kind of smile that has something beyond its surface, not happiness exactly, more like a person who has been carrying something enormous for a very long time and has finally been allowed to put it down. Then she cut her palm with the small blade hidden in her ring and began to transform. The fight in Stohes was catastrophic in the way Attack on Titan fights tend to be. Civilians were killed, buildings came down. The district, which had been entirely unprepared for what descended on it, was left in ruin. Eren and Annie fought as Titans across the rubble of a place that had nothing to do with their war. And by the end, after Eren had pulled Annie's Titan form apart and reduced her to her human shape, she reached for the crystal ability that was built into her power and sealed herself inside it. The crystal was impenetrable. She could not be questioned. She could not be reached. She went into something like a coma and stayed there for years, inside a wall in Paradis, suspended, waiting. The question that lingers behind Annie's story, even before the story goes any further, is not simply about loyalty or betrayal in the conventional sense. It is about what a person owes to the life they were made. Annie did not choose her situation. She was abandoned as a child, taken in by a man who saw her as a means to a more comfortable life, trained from infancy in a fighting style designed to make her useful to the Marleyan war machine. Her father was not cruel in the way monsters are. He was a man operating under the weight of what had been done to his people, an Eldian in a country that treated Eldians as subhuman, reaching for whatever advantage he could find. But the result of his reaching was a daughter who grew up understanding that love came with conditions, that she was useful before she was a person, and that the rest of the world did not owe her anything. She crippled him before she left for training, using the techniques he spent her entire childhood teaching her, and he was glad. He looked at what she had done to him and he was glad because she was strong enough now, strong enough to survive. Something shifted in him after that. By the time she departed for Paradis Island, he had found his way to something he had not managed to give her during all those years of training. He begged her to come home, not as a warrior who had completed her mission, just to come home. He said he would be on her side no matter what. She made him a promise she genuinely intended to keep. Everything she did on Paradis Island, every deception, every Titan form, every Survey Corps soldier who died in her wake, was in service of a promise to a man who had made her into a weapon and then, too late, tried to love her like a daughter. That is not a justification. The deaths were real, and the people inside those walls were real, and the harm she caused was enormous. But it is a context, and context is exactly what Attack on Titan is always asking its audience to hold alongside judgment, Because the story is never, not even once, interested in a simple reading of who the villains are. Reiner and Bertolt's reveal came differently. It came in Season 2, in an episode titled Warrior, and it came without a dramatic setup. Reiner was tired. He had been through Utgard Castle and survived things that were pushing against the edges of what a person could keep inside themselves without something breaking. He pulled Eren aside, on top of the wall in broad daylight, with other Survey Corps members close enough to overhear if they were paying attention. And he told Eren, almost conversationally, flatly, that he was the Armored Titan, that Bertolt was the Colossal Titan, that he wanted Eren to come with them. Eren went quiet. He looked at Reiner for a moment and then said, almost gently, that he understood, that it was okay, that Reiner was just exhausted and saying things he did not mean. He tried to give Reiner an out. He tried to make it not true by offering Reiner a way to step back from the words he had just said. But Reiner did not take the out. He showed Eren his wound, which was already closing, healing the way Titan shifters heal, faster than any human body should. And then Eren understood that the conversation was real, and the people he had trained with and eaten with and trusted for were the specific individuals responsible for the worst day of his life, he cried. Not in a loud way, in the quiet way of someone processing something so large that the usual responses do not apply. He transformed, because there was nothing else to do, and so did Reiner and Bertolt. The wall became a battleground that nobody standing on it that morning had expected to survive. Reiner's reveal worked differently from Annie's because of what the show had done with him in the years between. By the time he made his confession to Eren, the audience had spent a significant amount of time watching him behave in ways that were not easily reconcilable with someone executing a cold-blooded mission. He had saved people. He had grieved alongside them. He had shown what looked unmistakably like genuine attachment to the group he was supposed to be using and then abandoning. When the show returned to him in Season 4 and revealed the full scope of his psychology, the audience discovered what the confession on the wall had already half suggested. Reiner had fractured under the weight of maintaining two completely incompatible versions of himself. The warrior on a mission and the soldier who had become part of the people he was assigned to destroy. Both of those things were real. Neither one could cancel out the other. He had not become a mask. He had become two people at once, and both of them were in some sense genuine. Bertolt suffered differently and more quietly. He was not fractured in the way Reiner was. He understood very clearly what he was doing and what the cost of it was, and he lived with that understanding in a private space the show only occasionally illuminated. He knew Eren's mother had died because of what he did. He thought about it. He did not have a justification that satisfied. He just kept going, because there was no direction to go except forward, and no way to undo what had already been done. What Annie, Reiner, and Bertolt share, beneath all the differences in personality and presentation, is the condition of having been shaped into a specific kind of person long before they were old enough to consent to that shaping. Marley handed children a mission and called it purpose. It dressed exploitation in the language of honor and told them that the people on the other side of the ocean were monsters and devils who deserved whatever was coming to them, and it sent those children across the water and expected the programming to hold. For a long time, it held well enough. Then it began to come apart, not because the mission was poorly designed, but because the people assigned to it turned out to be exactly that. People have a difficult time spending years beside other people without being changed by them. The wolves among sheep, except the wolves, by the time the sheep found out, had forgotten they were wolves. That is the story Attack on Titan was telling from its very first episode, and most of the audience did not see it until the wall came down. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Annie, Reiner, and Bertolt set up one of the most layered betrayal stories in anime history. Three warriors shaped by a system that never gave them a choice, living double lives until the weight of it finally broke through. Next, we go even further back into the Jaeger family, to a boy who made a choice his parents never saw coming and changed everything because of it. Section 2. Zeke Jaeger, the son who sold his parents. Before understanding what Zeke Jaeger did, it helps to sit with where he started. Not with the war chief, not with the beast titan throwing boulders across the sky, not with the man who had a plan for the entire Eldian race and believed, with quiet certainty, that he was the only one willing to see it through. Start earlier than all of that. Start with a boy in the Liberio internment zone who just wanted his parents to have dinner with him. That is not a dramatic image. It does not sound like the setup for one of the most painful betrayals in the entire story. But that ordinariness is precisely the point. Zeke Jaeger was born into a family that was by every outward measure still a family. Grisha Jaeger and Dina Fritz were his parents. They were present in his life. They fed him and housed him and spoke to him every day. They were, depending on how generous the situation is read, doing what they believed was necessary for the survival of their people. And none of that changes the fact that a small boy grew up in that household feeling like a resource more than a son. Grisha was consumed by the cause of Eldian restoration in a way that left very little room for anything else. He had watched his sister Faye die as a child, fed to dogs by a Marleyan officer while their father accepted the injustice with his head down. that wound never healed. It became the engine of everything Grisha would go on to do. He joined the Eldian Restorationists, the underground movement working to overthrow Marley and reclaim what had been taken from the Inn people. He married Dina Fritz, who carried the royal bloodline of the Fritz family, because the Restorationists needed that blood. And when the Marley government announced its warrior program, recruiting Eldian children between the ages of 5 and 7 to serve as Titan shifters in exchange for their families receiving honorary Marleyan status, Grisha saw an opportunity. He enrolled Zeke. Zeke was 5 years old. The plan was clear enough in Grisha's mind. Zeke would enter the program, earn the trust of the Marleyan military, become a warrior, and use that position to serve the Restorationist cause from the inside. He would be a double agent, a mole planted in the very institution that oppressed his people. In Grisha's framework, this was not using his son. It was giving his son a purpose, a role in something larger than himself, a chance to do what no one in their generation had managed. The distinction between purpose and exploitation is one that ideologues often struggle to locate clearly. Grisha could not locate it at all. What Zeke experienced was different. He sat through lessons about Eldian history that he was too young to understand. He was walked through the internment zone with the expectation that he would absorb the weight of everything his people had suffered and translate that weight into political commitment. He was corrected when he asked the wrong questions and praised when he repeated the approved answers. He was told, in ways that did not need to be explicit to be fully understood, that his parents' love and his usefulness to the cause were connected. That falling short in training was not just a personal failure, but a failure to the mission. That the mission was what mattered. He was 7 years old when the warrior program recruiters came looking for candidates. The expectation on Zeke was enormous and visible. He felt it. He was not performing well enough to be a strong candidate, and the anxiety of disappointing his parents, who needed him to succeed for reasons that went far beyond his own welfare, was already eating at him. He was a child trying to carry an adult war. It was around this time that he encountered Tom Casaver. Casaver was the current holder of the Beast Titan, a researcher by inclination rather than a soldier, a quiet man who was most often found throwing a baseball against a wall by himself as a way of passing time and managing the weight of the life he was living. He noticed Zeke one day, struggling and muted and clearly miserable under the pressure of the program. He offered nothing grand. He threw the ball to him. That was all. Just a game of catch, the simplest possible thing two people can do together, and yet for Zeke, it was something entirely new. Here was an adult who was not measuring him against a mission, who was not watching his performance and calculating its usefulness, who was just there, throwing and catching, talking sometimes and quiet other times, asking nothing except that Zeke show up and throw the ball back. Casaver became the first real parent Zeke ever had. Not biologically, not legally, but in the way that actually shapes a person. He listened to Zeke. He encouraged him without conditions. He took an interest in who Zeke was rather than what Zeke could become. When he noticed that Zeke had an extraordinary natural throwing arm, he said so simply with genuine delight, the way someone reacts when they see something genuinely impressive in a person they care about. That kind of uncomplicated recognition from an adult was something Zeke had not experienced at home, where every piece of praise came attached to the question of whether it was enough. As Zeke grew and their relationship deepened, Casaver shared things with him that went beyond baseball. He told Zeke about his own life, about a Marleyan woman he had loved and had a child with, who had taken her own life and their son's life after learning that Casaver was Eldian. He spoke about what it meant to carry the burden of being born into a people that the world had decided were devils. He had spent his years as the Beast Titan holder not fighting but researching, studying the biology of the Titans, looking for answers in the memories the Titan powers carried. And in that research, he had arrived at a conclusion that would become the foundation of Zeke's entire adult life. The Eldian people, Casaver believed, could not win. They could not overthrow Marley. They could not reclaim their empire. The cycle of violence, the perpetual war over Titan powers, the hatred that had calcified across generations, these were not problems that could be solved by one generation deciding to fight harder. The only way to end the suffering of the Eldians was to end the Eldians themselves, not through mass murder, through a gradual, quiet process, using the power of the founding Titan, which could reach every Eldian in the world through the paths that connected them all, to render every subject of Ymir sterile. Within one generation, no new Eldians would be born. Within a century, the bloodline would be gone. The Titans would be gone with it, and the world would be free of the thing that had caused so much death. Zeke heard this and found it logical. More than logical, his parents had wanted to fight for liberation. Casaver was proposing something far quieter and far more final, a mercy, an end to the chain of suffering rather than another link in it. A boy who had grown up feeling like a tool of someone else's ideology heard in Casaver's plan the sound of a world where no more children would be weaponized by their parents' unresolved grief. He adopted it completely. The mechanics of the plan required two things: a member of the royal Fritz bloodline, whose power could unlock the full capability of the founding Titan, and the founding Titan itself, currently held somewhere on Paradise Island by the descendants of the Eldians who had been walled in over a century ago. Casaver asked Zeke to find both. Zeke vowed to try. But first, there was the matter of his parents. By the time Zeke was approaching the age at which the warrior program would either place him as a Titan inheritor or send him to Paradise to become a mindless Titan himself, the Marleyan authorities had begun closing in on the Eldian restoration. The movement Grisha had spent his life building was unraveling. It was only a matter of time before the people involved were identified and punished, and punishment for Eldian resistance under Marley meant being transformed into a pure Titan on Paradise Island, wandering endlessly in a body that had eaten the mind and left something hollowed out behind. Kasaver laid the situation out plainly. If the restorationists were caught, Zeke and his grandparents would almost certainly be implicated by association. The family connection alone could doom them. There was, Kasaver said, one way to ensure that only Grisha and Dina were punished and that Zeke and his grandparents were spared. Zeke could go to the Marleyan authorities himself. He could report his parents. He could frame his cooperation as loyalty to Marley, as a young warrior candidate horrified by what his parents had been doing behind closed doors, choosing the nation over his family. Marley would see that as proof of his reliability. His grandparents would be protected. He would go on. Zeke protested. Then he thought about it. Then he went. He was a child when he did it. This is worth saying clearly. He was a child who had been made to feel like a burden in his own home, who had found the first genuine warmth of his life in a man who then asked him to choose between his parents and his survival. He chose survival. He told the Marleyan authorities what he knew. Grisha and Dina were arrested, processed, and sent to Paradise Island, where they were injected with Titan serum and pushed off a wall to wander as mindless giants in the field. Below, Dina, who carried the royal blood of the Fritz line, would wander those fields for years. She would eventually eat Aaron's mother, which Aaron would learn decades later while standing in the paths with Zeke and watching the memory play out. The fullness of what Zeke had set in motion that day did not become visible much later. Marley, satisfied with Zeke's demonstrated loyalty, raised him with his grandparents and continued his warrior training. He inherited the Beast Titan from Xaver at 17, consuming his mentor in the prescribed ritual. He wore Xaver's glasses afterward for the rest of his life as the only visible marker of the relationship that had shaped him more completely than anything his parents had managed. He became, by all accounts, an extraordinarily effective warrior. He was the strongest in Marley's arsenal, respected even by Reiner, who had no reason to offer easy compliment. He was disciplined and strategic and utterly committed to the plan he and Kasaver had built together. He spent years maneuvering toward the moment when he could access the founding Titan and activate the euthanasia plan. Every alliance he formed, every betrayal he executed, every manipulation he attempted, including his eventual deception of Aaron himself, was in service of that single goal. He believed in it the way people believe in things they have decided to believe in, because the alternative, believing the suffering was all pointless, is too heavy to carry. What the story does with Zeke that is so quietly devastating is that it does not let the plan be simply wrong. His logic has an internal coherence. His pain is real. His observation that cycles of violence tend to produce more cycles of violence is not incorrect. He is not a villain in the sense of someone who enjoys harm or seeks power for its own sake. He is something harder to dismiss. A person who looked at a genuinely terrible world and arrived at a genuinely terrible solution and believed, with something approaching sincerity, that it was the kindest option available. But the story is also not willing to let him be simply. The final conversation between Zeke and Armin in the paths, in the space where Titan memories live and time moves differently, is not a philosophical debate about the merits of the euthanasia plan. Armin does not argue that Zeke's logic is flawed, because much of it is not. What Armin does instead is something quieter. He picks up what appears to be a leaf in the sand and speaks about small things, the memories that meant something not because they were important, but because they were shared. Running with friends, sitting in a market, the texture of an ordinary afternoon that had no grand purpose and no political dimension and was meaningful anyway, simply because it happened and was felt. Zeke looks up and the leaf in Armin's hand has become a baseball. He takes it. He remembers Xaver, not the plan, not the ideology. Just the afternoons of catch, the simple rhythm of throwing and being thrown to. The first adult who ever paid attention to him without an agenda. He says quietly that even though the game meant nothing, he would not mind being born again if it meant he could play catch once more. And then he stands and helps. The betrayal Zeke committed against his parents when he was a child never stopped rippling outward through the story. Its consequences reached Paradise Island and Aaron's mother and the rumbling itself. But in the paths in that final conversation, what the story quietly suggests is that the thing Zeke carried out of that betrayal was not the plan and not the ideal. It was the absence of a father, filled just barely by a man who played catch with him in the afternoon, and then asked him to use everything he had, learned in service of ending his people. He spent his entire life running toward a solution to suffering. He had learned what suffering was in his own childhood, at the hands of people who loved him in every way except the way that mattered. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Zeke's story is one of the most tragic in the series. A child shaped by ideology and saved briefly by something as simple as a game of catch, who spent his whole life trying to fix a pain he never quite named. Next, we go to the other Jaeger, the one who kept the deepest secrets of all, and whose choices set everything in motion long before Aaron ever knew his name. Section 3. Grisha Jaeger, the father who kept everything. Most stories about fathers keeping secrets frame the secret as the problem. The lie is the wound. Relation is the damage. Once the truth comes out, the audience understands why everything that followed was broken, and the father either confesses and is forgiven or confesses and is not. And either way, the shape of the story is clear. Attack on Titan is not that kind of story. Grisha Jaeger is not that kind of father. The secrets he kept from the people he loved were enormous, and the reveal of those secrets reshaped the entire world the audience had been watching. But what makes Grisha genuinely difficult to sit with is not the scale of what he hid. It is how deeply, underneath all of it, he seemed to mean well, and how little that meaning protected anyone from the consequences of what he chose not to say. When Aaron was young, the basement was simply a locked door. His father, a doctor of some repute in the Shiganshina district, kept a workspace below the family home and did not allow Aaron inside. Carla, Aaron's mother, told the boy when he asked that it was where his father kept his important tools. Grisha himself, on the occasions when Aaron pressed harder, deflected with the kind of quiet patience that fathers sometimes use when they know the truth is something the child is not yet ready for. He told Aaron once that perhaps he would show him the basement when Aaron understood the most important thing of all. That answer satisfied nobody, but it was accepted, the way children accept the answers adults give them, when the tone makes clear that no further question will be welcome. What was in that basement was not medical equipment. 3 books, handwritten in careful detail across years of quiet work, contained the whole of what Grisha knew. His early life in Marley, growing up as an Eldian in the internment zone of Liberio, watching his sister Faye wander out of the allowed district one day and never come home. She was not taken by Titans. She was not lost. She was found by Marleyan officers, one of whom brought her home the following day with a story of accidental drowning. Grisha's father accepted this story. He was afraid not to. But Grisha was there, and what he saw in the expression of the officer who returned his sister did not match the account of an accident. And that gap between what was said and what was real became the seed of everything that would follow. He joined the Eldian Restoration. He married Dina Fritz. He raised Zeke inside an ideology he believed in deeply enough to entrust it to a child. When Zeke was taken from him, Grisha went to Paradis, and Aaron Kruger, the leader of the Restorationists who had been hiding inside Marley's own government for decades, passed the power of the Attack Titan to him before his own time ran out. With it came a mission. Go inside the walls, find someone worth, pass the Titan on, complete what the Restorationists had started. He arrived in Shiganshina with no memory he could safely claim as his own. He presented himself as a traveler who had lost his recollection, and Keith Shadis, who would later become the commander of the Survey Corps, brought him into the walls and helped him build a life. Grisha found work as a doctor. He treated a local family struck by illness, including a young woman named Carla, and in the process of saving her life, he fell into something that looked, by every available measure, like genuine love. He married her. They had a son named Aaron, and for a period of time that the story does not measure precisely, Grisha put his mission aside and simply lived. This is the part of Grisha that is hardest to account for neatly. He was not a man who had forgotten what he was sent to do. The basement was there. The journals were accumulating. He had 13 years from the moment he received the Attack Titan before the curse would take him, and he knew that the clock was running, and he allowed himself to live alongside that knowledge with something approaching contentment. He loved Carla in a way he had not been able to fully love Dina, who had always been partly a partner in the mission before she was a wife. He loved Aaron in the uncomplicated way of a father who has been given a second chance and knows it. He did not burden Aaron with ideology the way he had burdened Zeke. He encouraged the boy's curiosity about the outside world, but he let the curiosity be Aaron's own rather than shaped and directed by his own political agenda. He was trying in whatever way he knew how to be different the second time. The wall coming down changed all of that in a single morning. When the colossal Titan appeared at the gate of Shiganshina and the armored Titan broke through the inner gate, the district where Grisha's family lived was overrun. He was away from the house when it happened, gone on what the story presents as a medical call. Carla was not able to run. She was trapped under debris from a collapsing building, and by the time Aaron and Mikasa found her, she could not move her legs, and she told Hannes to take the children and go rather than waste time trying to free her. She was eaten by a Titan while her son watched from across the rubble. That Titan was Dina Fritz, Grisha's first wife, who had been turned into a pure Titan after Zeke reported her to the Marleyan authorities years before. The woman who ate Carla was the woman Grisha had loved first, wandering the fields of Paradis in a body that had consumed her mind. Grisha would not have known this when he arrived at the Rice Chapel that same day. The connection would not become fully visible until much later, when the whole of the timeline had been laid out. But it is the kind of detail the story places in the architecture of events for a reason. Grisha's past and Grisha's present were not separate lives he had managed to keep apart. They had always been moving toward each other. He arrived at the Rice Chapel with the knowledge that the walls were breached and his wife was dead, and the mission that he had allowed to sleep for years had suddenly become urgent again in the most brutal possible way. What he found there was the royal family, the Rice family, who had held the power of the founding Titan for over a century and had never used it to protect the people inside the walls, bound by the vow of renouncing war that the first king had encoded into the Titan's power. He appealed to Frida Rice, the current holder of the founding Titan, begging her to act, to use the power she carried to stop what was happening beyond the walls. Frida, herself controlled by the ideological inheritance of the first king's decision, refused. She said the people of Paradise deserved the fate coming to them. Grisha was a doctor. He had spent decades of his life trying to help people stay alive. He looked at the children in that underground chapel, and he could not do what the mission asked of him. He had transformed, started to pull the attack Titan around himself, and then stopped. He let the transformation fall away. He put down the knife. The children were right there, and he was a man who had built half his life around the principle that lives were worth preserving. And then Eren spoke to him from the future. The Attack Titan, uniquely among the 9 Titan powers, carries the ability for its holders to see the memories of future inheritors. Eren, who would come to possess the Attack Titan after Grisha passed it to him, could reach backward through those memories and speak to Grisha in the moment of his greatest hesitation. He reminded his father of Faye, of Dina, of the Restorationists who had been turned into Titans in the Forest of Giants while Grisha watched, of Carla, dead that morning in the rubble of their home. He pushed into his father's memory all of the accumulated weight of what Marley had done to the Eldian. People across generations, the specific losses that had shaped Grisha's entire life, and he did it at precisely the moment when Grisha had decided he could not go forward. Grisha went forward. He killed the Rice family. He ate Frida and took the founding Titan. He spared Rod Reese, the one survivor, by what the story later suggests was Eren's specific instruction. Then he went to find his son Eren in the woods outside the destroyed district, injected him with a Titan serum that would allow him to transform and consume a Titan shifter, and gave the young boy both the Attack Titan and the Founding Titan in the same act. Then he stood there and waited to be eaten, because the curse of Ymir gave every Titan shifter only 13 years from the moment of inheritance, and he had already run his years out and had nothing left except the choice of where and how to end. Eren consumed him as a pure Titan, not yet knowing what he was doing or why, and Grisha Jaeger was gone. What he left behind was a locked door, 3 books, and a son who spent years believed that the man who raised him had been a good doctor with some private interests he was not ready to share. When Eren and Mikasa and Levi finally broke into the basement at the end of Season 3, after the Battle of Shiganshina had cost them almost everyone they went there to protect, the first thing they found inside the hidden drawer beneath Grisha's desk was a photograph. Not a painting or a drawing, but a photograph, a technology that no one inside the walls had encountered before, and that immediately announced itself as proof that the world was larger and more advanced than anything the people of Paradise had been allowed to know. The photograph showed a family, Grisha, younger, standing beside a woman who was not Carla, with a boy who was not Eren. It showed the world from which Grisha had come, a world with technology and history, and a perspective on the people inside the walls that was not kindly. It showed everything Carla had never known about the man she met. Eren's reaction to the journals was complex in a way the story does not try to simplify. He was not simply angry, though there was anger in it. He was not simply grieving, though that was there too. He was confronting the specific feeling of discovering that the life you believed you were living was assembled from selective truths, that the person who shaped your earliest understanding of the world had shaped it very deliberately and very incompletely, and that the gaps he left were not accidents but choices. Grisha had chosen not to tell Carla about his past. He had chosen not to tell Eren about the world beyond the walls until the moment he felt Eren was ready, a moment that never arrived before the walls fell. He had chosen to put the weight of the entire mission inside a boy who had no frame of reference for what he was being given. That choice, more than any single act of violence in Grisha's history, is where the betrayal lived, not the slaughter of the Reese family, because the story surrounds that with enough complexity that simple judgment becomes difficult, not the years of deception that began the moment Grisha crossed into Paradise and pretended to be a man with no history. Those can all be read with enough generosity as the actions of someone genuinely trying to protect the people he had come to love from a truth they were not equipped to survive. The deeper wound is that Grisha never found the moment. He spent 9 years in Shiganshina living beside a woman and raising a son while carrying knowledge that would have changed everything about how they understood their own lives. He kept telling himself he was waiting for the right time, that Eren would understand it better when he was older, that the distance between what he knew and what he was telling them was manageable, was temporary, was for their own good. People who keep enormous secrets from the people they love almost always believe this about their silence, that the timing is not right, that the other person cannot handle it, that the secret is an act of care rather than a failure of trust. Grisha was not a monster. The story makes this clear across the full span of its telling. He was a man who had been made into a particular shape by a particular history, who tried with genuine effort to be something different in his second life, and who ultimately could not escape the pull of what he had started in his first one. When he held Zeke in the paths at the very end of the story, after Zeke had helped redirect the Titan powers away from Aaron's control, Grisha wept. He apologized for what he had done with Zeke's childhood, for making his son a tool before he had made him a person, for all the years he spent on the mission while the boy just wanted to throw a ball around. In the afternoon, he had seen it finally. Too late for it to change anything, but genuinely, with the specific grief of a person who understands the harm they caused and cannot undo it. He asked Zeke to stop Aaron. He had seen, in the rice chapel, a flicker of what his second son was heading toward. He had gone through with it anyway, because the grief of Carla's death had reignited something in him that his years in Shiganshina had been quietly cooling. But the knowing was in him, and it sat there unresolved. And in the paths, it came out as a father reaching for a son he had never properly held and asking him to fix what he could not. 3 books in a locked drawer beneath a doctor's office in a city that had been destroyed years before anyone found them. That was what Grisha left the world. A body of truth written down carefully and hidden with equal care, passed on to a son who grew up to use it in ways Grisha did not foresee and could not have stopped even if he had. The father who kept everything kept it just long enough for it to belong entirely to someone else. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Grisha spent 2 lifetimes carrying secrets that shaped everyone around him, and the full cost of that silence only became visible long after he was gone. Next, we turn to the son he raised inside those walls, the boy who grew into something none of them expected, and the moment Eren Yeager stopped being the person his friends thought they knew. Section 4. Eren's Great Betrayal, the friend who became the enemy there, is a moment early in Attack on Titan, somewhere in the quiet stretch before the walls fall, where Eren Yeager sits with Armin and listens to descriptions of the outside world from a book Armin's grandfather kept hidden. Armin talks about oceans and deserts and land covered in ice and fire. Eren listens with everything he has. His face does not go calculating or distant. He is just a boy hearing about a world larger than anything he has been allowed to imagine, and wanting it with the pure, uncomplicated hunger of someone who has not yet learned that wanting something that much usually means it is going to cost something equally large to reach. That boy is genuinely present throughout the earth. He is impulsive and loud, and sometimes reckless in ways that get people hurt. He has a temper that overtakes him regularly, and a level of raw determination that occasionally reads as stubbornness rather than conviction. He is not a soft character even then, but the people around him know what he is made of. They know the version of Eren who charged back into a Titan's mouth to save Armin when they were children. They know the version who promised Mikasa they would go back to their home someday. They know the version who stood in the rain on the battlefield and cried for the people who died, trying to make the world a little less terrible. That Eren was real. What makes Season 4 so hard to sit with is that this Eren was also completely genuine, and something replaced him so gradually that nobody could locate the exact moment of departure. The replacement did not arrive all at once. It came in stages, each one a small degree of change, each one individually explainable, none of them obviously announcing that the person underneath was being remade into something his friends would not recognize. The first shift came with the basement. When Eren opened those 3 books in his father's hidden study and read what Grisha had spent years recording, he did not simply gain information. He gained a frame. He learned that the people inside the walls were not the last of humanity. He learned that the world outside those walls had been watching Paradise Island for a century, debating what to do about it, and landing repeatedly on the conclusion that the Eldians living there were a threat to be managed or eliminated. He learned that the hatred aimed at his people was not irrational or isolated. It was institutional, widespread, generational, and actively maintained by a military superpower that had been sending warrior children across the ocean to retrieve the power of the founding Titan. And he learned all of this in a single reading, in a ruined basement, surrounded by people who were also just learning it and had not yet figured out how to carry it. Most of them staggered under the weight and eventually found a way to hold it alongside the other things they believed in. They wanted to fight, but they also wanted to find another way. They wanted to protect parity, but they also did not want to become the thing the world already accused them of being. They held the contradiction and stayed inside it, because that is what people do when the alternatives are all terrible. Eren stopped being able to hold the contradiction at some point after that. Reading and the speed of his movement toward a single fixed answer was not visible to the people around him until it was already complete. By the time Season 4 opened with a time jump of 4 years, the distance between Eren and the boy from the basement was already enormous. He had grown in the physical sense, taller and harder looking, with long hair and a quietness that replaced the old volatility. The volatility had not gone away. It had gone inward, where it built something more structural and more dangerous than impulsive anger. He had spent those 4 years thinking about the ocean he finally saw, about the enemies waiting on the other side of it, about what the world's refusal to let Paradis exist in peace meant for every person he had grown up beside. And he had arrived somewhere his friends had not arrived, quietly and ahead of them and without inviting them along. He infiltrated Marley alone. He did not tell the Survey Corps he was going. He did not ask for their input or their permission or their help. He went across the ocean, found a way into Marley's territory, spent months living there under a false identity, and then attacked a military gathering in Liberio that included not just soldiers but civilians, diplomats, families who had traveled for what was meant to be a celebratory event. He emerged from the crowd as the attack titan and destroyed what was in front of him with the kind of methodical precision that has nothing casual about it. He had thought about this. He had planned it. He had decided it was what needed to happen, and he had gone and done it. And when the Survey Corps arrived to extract him, they were not rescuers arriving at a plan they had agreed to. They were people scrambling to manage the aftermath of a decision they had not been consulted on and could not undo. Sasha died on the airship back, shot by a 14-year-old Marleyan warrior candidate who had boarded in grief and fury at what Aaron had started. Sasha, who had been with them since the beginning, who had been one of the most recognizable and beloved constants in their circle. She died because Aaron moved unilaterally, and the consequences of that movement were not confined to They landed on the people he was supposed to be protecting, too. The conversation that followed, the confrontation between Aaron and Armin and Mikasa that took place at a restaurant in Paradise, is one of the most quietly devastating scenes the series produces. Three people who grew up as something like family, sitting across a table from each other, with years of shared survival between them, and the distance between them already too wide to close by talking. Armin asked Aaron to explain himself. Aaron did not offer the explanation Armin was looking for. Instead, he told Mikasa something that landed in the room like a physical blow. He told her he had always hated her. He picked apart her devotion to him, framing it not as love or loyalty, but as a biological compulsion built into her bloodline, as if she had never made a choice about him in her life, but had simply been programmed to orbit him. He said he found it disgusting. He said she was like livestock. Mikasa had never once failed him. She had nearly died for him more times than anyone could properly count. She had carried that scarf he gave her across every terrible thing that happened between them, and the one moment he spoke to her directly about what she meant to him across all those years, it was to tell her she meant nothing except as a function of her genetics. She sat there and her face broke and she could not stop it. Armin threw himself across the table. Aaron knocked him aside without difficulty, said something about why they never fight being because Armin would always lose, and let the scene end with both of them in the wreckage of the conversation and nothing resolved. What the finale would later reveal is that the cruelty in that room was a calculation. Aaron was not expressing how he felt about Mikasa. He loved her. He loved Armin. The story makes this clear in the paths, in the conversation between Aaron and Armin that Aaron later asked Armin to forget, where he said he did not want Mikasa to be with anyone else, ever, for the rest of her life, and then told Armin not to tell her. The words at the restaurant were designed to do something specific. He needed Mikasa to be able to kill him when the moment came. He knew that if she still believed he loved her, she might hesitate, so he removed the thing she was most sure of, the one constant in her life. Since the day he put a scarf around her shoulders in the winter after her parents, he took it away from her with a lie, precisely because he knew it was the thing that would work. This is where Aaron's betrayal becomes genuinely hard to hold in a single frame, because the cruelty was real. She felt it as real, and it damaged her as real, and she did not know it was a lie for a long time. And at the same time, the love behind it was also real. He was not performing affection for the finale's benefit. He had always loved the people around him, and the rumbling, the march of countless colossal titans across the continents of the world to destroy every military threat to Paradis was motivated partly by something he believed he was doing for them. He wanted his friends to live. He wanted them to live in a world that was no longer systematically trying to kill them for what they were. He wanted the next generation of children on Paradise Island to grow up without the specific weight he had grown up under, the weight of being despised by a world they had never been allowed to see. He had looked at every other option and concluded that none of them would hold. Diplomacy had been tried and had failed before it started. The world's hatred for Eldians was too deep and too broadly shared to be reasoned away. The only way to remove the threat was to remove the people who posed the threat, and Aaron had somehow arrived at a place where he could hold that thought steady inside himself without breaking under it. What he could not carry was the full awareness of what he was. In the paths, before the final battle, he admitted to Armin that something in him simply wanted to see it happen. Beyond the strategy and beyond the plan and beyond the stated goal of protecting his friends, there was a part of him that had looked at the world from the outside and decided, on some level that was not fully accessible to reason, that he wanted it gone. The ocean he had dreamed about as a boy, the endless land beyond the world. He had finally seen it and discovered that it was full of people who would never stop wanting Paradis destroyed, and that discovery had done something to him that could not be. His friends stopped him. The Survey Corps, who had spent a season trying to decide whether the person Aaron had become was still the person they had chosen to follow, eventually chose to fight. Not for Marley, not for the world that had done nothing to earn their protection, but because the march of the Titans was destroying things that should not be destroyed, and because the Aaron they had known would have known that too, somewhere underneath what he had become. Mikasa found him inside the mouth of the founding titan at the end. She reached him in his human form. She kissed him. She cut off his head. He had told her he hated her and spent the last months of his life arranging circumstances so that she would be the one to kill him, because he knew she was the only person who could reach him, and he knew she would do what needed doing, even though it would break something in her that would never fully come back together. The lie was a gift of a kind. The worst kind, the kind that only looks like a gift in retrospect, after the damage has already been absorbed and there is nothing left to protect. That is Eren's betrayal, not the rumbling itself, which is enormous enough that simple moral language cannot quite reach it. The betrayal is what he did to the people who loved him, the way he managed their grief and their choices and their futures with the quiet precision of someone who believed he knew better than they did what they needed. He took their agency, the very thing he said he valued above everything, and he directed it toward the outcome he had already decided on. He became, in the end, exactly the kind of person he had always said he despised. Someone who decided for others what kind of future was worth living. And somewhere inside all of that, he was also still the boy who wanted to see the ocean. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Eren's betrayal is the one that reshapes every relationship in the series, a love story and a tragedy folded into the same decision. Next, we turn to someone whose own quiet betrayal has been sitting in the background of the story since Season 2, a young woman named Ymir who made a choice for the person she loved and never got to explain why. Section 5. Ymir and the choice she made for Historia. Start somewhere ordinary. Start with two people sitting together during a blizzard, somewhere in the mountains during a training exercise that went wrong. One of them, Krista Lenz, is trying to keep another cadet named Daz alive, in conditions that are pushing well past what any of them are equipped to handle. She is doing the things she always does, putting herself at risk to take care of someone else, wearing the performance of selflessness so smoothly that most people around her accept it as simply who she is. The other person watching her, a tall girl with sharp eyes and a slight distance between herself and everyone around her named Ymir, does not accept it at all. Ymir looks at Krista and sees the performance for what it is. She does not say this gently. She is not gentle, not in any way that comes easily or naturally. She tells Krista that she is not doing any of this out of goodness but out of a death wish, that she is living for other people because she does not believe she deserves to live for herself, and that the beautiful, saintly reputation she has built among the cadets is a costume rather than a character. She says all of this bluntly and with the specific accuracy of someone who recognizes the shape of the wound because they carry a version of it themselves. That moment in the blizzard is the center of what Ymir is, not the Jaw Titan, not the 60 years of wandering, not the letter she wrote before she went back to Marley to be eaten. The center of Ymir is a person who had been stripped of every version of herself worth having, who had built a new self from nothing in the rubble of all of that, and who spent the years inside the walls as the only person in the room who could look at another person's carefully maintained front and name what was behind it. She had done the same thing herself. She knew what it looked like from the outside. Her real story begins far earlier than the walls and far earlier than the Survey Corps, and the distance between where she started and where the audience first encountered her is part of what makes her one of the most quietly devastating figures in the entire series. She had no name when she was found. She was a child living on the streets of a Marleyan city, a homeless Eldian girl with no family and no future that anyone around her was particularly concerned about providing. A man found her and gave her a name. The name he gave her was Ymir, after the ancient founder of all Titans, the original source of the Titan power that had been splitting the world into factions for centuries. He dressed her in white robes and presented her to a group of Eldians who were already worshipping the memory of Ymir Fritz, already building a small and desperate spiritual community around the idea that the royal blood of the Fritz line still existed somewhere, and that if it could be found, something about their situation might change. The man told them he had found her. He told them she carried Fritz blood. He had not, and she did not. She was a homeless child who had no more Fritz ancestry than anyone else in that ghetto, and the man who named her knew this perfectly. But she was young and she was available, and he needed someone to play the role, so she played it, and for a time it worked. The community gathered around her. They believed in her. They brought her into their lives and their rituals and gave her the only belonging she had ever had. She was still a fraud, but she was a fed and sheltered fraud, which was an enormous improvement over what she had been before. When the Marleyan authorities discovered the cult and moved to shut it down, the man who had given her the name and built the entire community on her false identity did the only thing a person of his specific character could be expected to do. He told them she had deceived him. He stepped back from everything he had constructed and pointed at the child he had created it around and said she was the one responsible. She had tricked him into believing her claims of royal blood. None of it was his fault. She was 11 years old. Ymir had a choice in that moment. She could have told the truth, which was complicated and might or might not have helped her. She could have pointed back at the man and contradicted his account, which she had every reason to do. She did neither. She kept the name. She stood with the role that had been given to her and absorbed the punishment that came with it, not because she believed in the cult or in her own false identity, but because by then the name was the only thing she had that felt like hers. Even if it was stolen, even if it was a costume, it was the first name anyone had ever given her. She was not willing to give it back even to save herself. She and the rest of the cult members were taken to the edge of Paradise Island, injected with Titan serum and pushed off a wall into the fields below. They became pure Titans, mindless and wandering, subject to the curse of Ymir that would keep them alive but stripped of everything that made them. People, it was meant to be permanent. Pure Titans without a Titan shifter to consume do not simply revert to human form. They wander until something ends them, which in the wastes outside the walls meant wandering effectively forever because there was nothing out there equipped to end a Titan. Ymir wandered for 60 years. 60 years without language, without memory, without any continuous sense of self. She described it afterward as an endless nightmare. She did not have enough awareness to experience it as suffering in a conventional sense, but she had enough to know time was passing and that she was caught in something she could not exit. The body that wandered those fields for 6 decades was not quite her, but was not entirely empty of her either. Some thread of the person she had been survived inside it, too thin to act on anything, thick enough to make the wandering feel like something more than simply moving. In 845, on the shoreline near where the Marleyan warriors were making their crossing to Paradise Island, she felt the presence of people. Marcel Galliard, Rainer Braun, Berthold Hoover, and Annie Leonhardt were moving toward Wall Maria at the beginning of the mission that would break the gate and let the Titans in. Something in her body responded to the proximity of people the way pure Titans always do, and she moved toward them. She lunged for Rainer. Marcel shoved Rainer out of the way and was caught instead. She ate him. She did not know what she was doing in any conscious sense. She was a Titan responding to instinct. But eating Marcel, who carried the power of the Jaw Titan, transferred that power to her. She returned to human form on the shore of Paradise Island with the sun on her face for the first time in 60 years. She was, in the most literal possible sense, free. Not free in any grand political or ideological. Free in the smallest sense. Conscious, human-shaped, standing upright, able to choose what to do next. She had no plan and no mission and no ideology. She went inside the walls and built a life from whatever was available, moving between the districts of the interior, eventually entering the military not out of commitment to any cause, but because it was the most reliable structure she could attach herself to. She was surviving, which was the only thing she had ever been doing. She was sharp and she was blunt and she was difficult to spend time with, and none of that was performance. She had used up whatever instinct towards softness she might have had during the years when the cult needed her to be their goddess. What remained was direct and occasionally unkind and absolutely incapable of pretending to feel things she did not feel. Most people kept a comfortable distance. Historia, who was herself maintaining an elaborate performance of a different kind, was drawn to her instead of repelled. Their relationship does not announce itself as the emotional center of Ymir's story. It builds quietly across the early seasons, in the way that things between people who are genuinely right for each other sometimes build in small accumulations rather than dramatic declarations. Ymir saw through Historia in the blizzard. Historia saw through Ymir more gradually, and the seeing was mutual, and the trust that grew from it was the first trust either of them had that was not conditional performance. When Ymir transformed at Utgard Castle to save the cadets who were surrounded and outmatched and running out of options, she was not performing loyalty. She simply moved. The people in that castle were not all people she was particularly close to, but Historia was among them, and that was enough. Rainer and Bertolt recognized her Titan form as the one that had eaten Marcel. They had been looking for it for years. They understood immediately that capturing her was now necessary. What happened in the moments after the battle, in the forest, while decisions were being made about who would go where and who would take Eren, and what the next move in the war between Paradis and Marley would be, is where Ymir's betrayal sat. She looked at the situation clearly. Rainer and Bertolt were going back to Marley with or without her. They had Eren. They were leaving. And Ymir understood something the Survey Corps did not yet fully understand, that what she carried inside her was borrowed, and that the people it had been borrowed from had a claim on it that would eventually need to be settled. She had eaten Marcel without choosing to. She had taken 60 years of his brother's family's inheritance in the process. She had lived inside the walls on stolen time and a stolen power and a stolen second chance at being a person. And she had known from the moment she emerged from that Titan form on the shore that eventually she would have to account for it. She had just hoped for more time than she got. She told Historia she was going. She did not fully explain. She could not explain in a way that would make Historia understand and still agree with the decision, and she needed Historia to be angry enough to let her go, rather than devoted enough to follow. She called herself an idiot. She said she would be a souvenir for Rainer and Bertolt, so they would not return to Marley completely empty-handed. She framed it as settling a debt. That was true as far as it went, but it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that she believed Historia was safer without her. If she went back to Marley and gave them the Jaw Titan, Rainer and Bertolt would have something to show for their mission that did not involve pursuing Historia further. Historia, who was the legitimate heir to the walls and who Ymir had known, would eventually be pulled into the politics of titans and bloodlines. Whether Ymir stayed or left would be marginally less of a target if the warriors already had what they came for. The calculation was not precise and it was not guaranteed to work, but it was what Ymir had, and she made it. She went back to Marley. She wrote a letter to Historia from them, a long letter that Reiner delivered much later, in which she explained her real history, name she was given and how it was taken from her, the 60 years as a Titan and what that had been like in the limited, terrible way she could describe it, the shore where she became human again, the walls and the Survey Corps and the blizzard in the mountains where she told a girl with a false name that she was allowed to live for herself. She wrote it the way someone writes a letter they know will arrive after they are gone. She allowed herself to be eaten by Porco Galliard, Marcel's younger brother. She returned the Jaw Titan to the family it had been taken from. She died, or something close enough to death to make the distinction mostly semantic, in a deliberate act of restitution that nobody had demanded of her and that she had arrived at entirely on. Historia read the letter and understood, as much as anyone could understand it, what Ymir had done and why. The story does not give Historia a moment of clean grief or clean acceptance. It gives her the weight of the letter and the absence of the person who wrote it, and it lets that sit without resolution, because that is what absence actually is. Ymir's betrayal of the Survey Corps, of Paradis, of the people who had fought beside her and trusted her with their lives, was quiet and deliberate and made entirely out of love for one specific person. She did not have a political agenda. She did not have a grand plan. She had a calculation made in a few seconds on a battlefield, based on the one thing she had managed to build in 60 years of wandering, and a few more of surviving inside the walls, the knowledge that Historia deserved to live, and that protecting that life was worth whatever it cost. She had spent her whole existence as someone else's symbol and someone else's tool. The choice she made at the end was entirely her own, even if it looked, from the outside, exactly like every other sacrifice she had never been given a choice about. She knew the difference. That was enough. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Ymir's story is one of the most complete in the series, a full life lived in borrowed time, ending in a choice that was finally entirely hers. Next, we turn to the girl she left behind, the one who spent years hiding her own name, and what it cost Historia Rice to finally stop pretending to be someone else. Section 6. Historia, the girl behind the name. There is a farm in the northern reaches of Wal Sheena, where a girl grew up mostly alone. Not alone in the sense of being the only person present. There were people nearby, family of her mother's side, working the land and going about the ordinary business of farming life inside the walls, but alone in the particular way of a child who understands, at an age far too young for that understanding, that she is not quite wanted by the person who is supposed to want her. Her mother, Alma, was beautiful and distant in equal measure, a woman who had loved someone she should not have loved and produced a consequence she did not know how to face. That consequence was Historia, and Alma spent most of Historia's childhood looking at her daughter with the expression of someone who has tried and failed to feel something they believe they ought to feel. Historia knew. Children always know, even before they have the language for it. She knew her existence was a complication in someone else's life, rather than a source of joy in her. She knew the farm was a place she had been put, rather than a place she had been brought. The fence around the property marked not just a boundary, but a containment. There were children outside those fences who sometimes threw rocks, and she watched from inside and did not go out. And the world beyond the fence became something she feared in the quiet, thorough way that children fear things they have been taught to fear without being told directly. And then, periodically, there was Frida. Frida Rice was Historia's older half-sister. She was the legitimate daughter of Rod Rice, and she carried, by the time she was 15, the power of the Founding Titan, which she had inherited from her uncle Yuri in the way the Founding Titan had passed down through the Rice family for generations. She was kind in a way that was not performance. She came to the farm and played with Historia and taught her to read and taught her to write and took her horseback riding across the fields and sat with her and told her stories. She brought a book once, a storybook about a heroine named Krista, a gentle and selfless girl who lived to help others and was loved for it, and she read it to Historia and then told her that this was how she should try to live. Be like Krista, be kind, help people. The world was full of hardship and kindness was what made it bearable. At the end of every visit, Frida used the power of the Founding Titan to erase Historia's memory. She would leave, and Historia would wake from something like a dreamless sleep with no knowledge that a visit had occurred, no trace of the warmth, no memory of the story, or the horseback riding, or the lesson of kindness. Just the farm and the fence and the distant mother and the ordinary weight of being a child nobody had chosen. This happened repeatedly across Historia's early childhood. Frida came and loved her and erased the evidence of that love before leaving. She did this out of protection, because knowing about Frida meant knowing about the Reese family, and knowing about the Rice family meant knowing things that powerful people had decided were dangerous for Historia to carry. The erasure was an act of care. It was also an act of theft. Every time Frida left and took the memory with her, Historia lost something she did not know she had lost, which is a specific kind of deprivation that leaves no clear wound because there is no clear awareness of what is missing. She simply felt a vague incompleteness that she could not account for and that nobody could explain to her. What remained was the name Krista, not the memories of Frida reading the story because those were gone, but the lesson, woven somehow into the way Historia understood herself, persisted. Be kind, help others, be selfless. The heroine of the story was someone people loved, and Historia, who had grown up being not quite loved by the person who was supposed to love her, unconditionally understood very early that love was something that came to people who were useful to others, who were good and giving and put other people's needs ahead of their own. Krista was the blueprint for being the kind of person the world would choose. Historia started trying to become her. Then the walls fell. When Wall Maria came down in 845 and the chaos of the Titan invasion spread through the southern districts, the disruption reached even the quiet farm. Rod Rice arrived with soldiers. There was a confrontation that Historia was present for but too young to fully comprehend. Alma, her mother, was confronted about Historia's existence, about the child she had produced, with a man whose bloodline was the most politically sensitive in the Con world. Alma denied it. She looked at the soldiers and at Rod and denied that Historia was her daughter and denied any relationship to the Reese household, trying to sever herself from the consequence before the consequence could drag her down. The soldiers moved toward Historia regardless. Rod intervened. He offered a deal. Historia would not be killed. She would simply disappear. She would take a new name and a new identity, enter the military, and live as a person who had no connection to the Rice family and no claim to anything that being a Rice implied. In exchange, she would be alive. The alternative to the deal was not complicated to understand. Historia accepted. She had no real choice but accept, and Rod knew this, and the soldiers knew this, and the transaction was completed quickly. Alma's last words to her daughter before Kenny Ackerman cut her throat were that she wished Historia had never been born. She looked at her child and said this. Then she was gone. The name Krista Lenz was the name Rod gave her. She entered a refugee camp with that name, waited until she was old enough, and enlisted in the military as Krista Lenz, a quiet girl of no particular background and no notable history. She was not performing the Krista identity from scratch. She had already been building it for years, because Krista was the only model for being loved that she had ever been given. Now she had a name to attach to it. She wore it completely. She helped Sasha when Sasha was being disciplined and went hungry in the rain. She volunteered for the Scout Regiment with a sincerity that felt genuine to everyone watching and a part of herself because she had lived inside the role enough that she sometimes could not locate the boundary between the performance and the person. Ymir could locate it. Ymir looked at her from across the room during training and saw the shape of the wound instantly because it resembled her own wound closely enough to be recognizable. She told Historia in the blizzard that she was not actually kind. She was not actually selfless. She was a person who had been taught that her own life had no inherent value and who had built a secondary life out of usefulness to others as a substitute for the life she did not believe she deserved. That was not goodness. That was a sophisticated version of not wanting to be alive. Historia did not argue. She knew Ymir was right in the way you know things that you have been keeping from yourself for a long time, and that someone has just said out loud, without asking permission. The years inside the Scout Regiment pulled at the costume steadily. The crisis in Season 3, the discovery of her actual identity, the reunion with Rod Reese in the cavern beneath the chapel, all of it tore at the seams of Krista Lenz until the person underneath had nowhere left to hide. Rod brought her to where Aaron was chained in the underground chamber, and he told her the history she had been denied. He told her that Frida had existed and had loved her, and that Grisha Jaeger had killed Frida and taken the founding Titan from her. He produced a syringe. He said she could eat Aaron and take the founding Titan back into the Rias bloodline belonged, and in doing so, perhaps recover something of Frida through the Titan's inherited memory. For a moment, she considered it. The memories of Frida had flooded back when she touched Aaron's hands in that underground space, and those memories were devastating in the quiet way of things you always suspected were real but could not reach. A sister who had visited and loved her and erased every trace of herself before leaving. A kindness that was real and then made deliberately inaccessible. Historia sat with the syringe in her hands and thought about what it meant to be a race and what she owed the family, and whether becoming the thing Rod was asking her to become was the same as, or different from what she had already been doing her whole life, which was becoming what other people needed her to be. Then she heard Ymir's voice in her memory, the blizzard, the specific instruction to live for herself, not for others, not for the performance, not for anyone else's idea of what she was supposed to be worth. She threw the syringe down. She did not speak dramatically. She pushed Rod off his feet, which knocked him backward hard enough to matter, and she went to free Aaron. Rod, in the desperation of someone watching the only plan he had left collapse, licked the Titan serum from the stone floor and transformed. He became something enormous and wrong-looking, the largest Titan the series had produced by that point, crawling toward the city above because his body was too large and too malformed to move any other way, heading toward the highest concentration of people as abnormal titans always do. Historia fought alongside the Survey Corps to stop him. She moved through the aerial battle with the vertical maneuvering equipment, cutting through the debris of the exploding titan, looking for the piece that contained the nape. She found it. She cut through it. She killed the man who had given her a name and a deal, and nothing that could fairly be described as a childhood. And as she cut through the flesh, she saw a flash of his memories, a young Rod in his own family's prison, generations of the same vow being passed down like an inheritance of surrender. She landed in the city. Citizens surrounded her. They did not know who she was. She was not wearing her uniform. They asked her if she was the one who had finished the Titan. She was not certain in that moment whether the decision had truly been hers or whether she was still being pulled by something old. Then she stood up. She told them she was Historia Rice, the true ruler of the walls. The coronation that followed was not a triumphant moment in the conventionals. She had spent her whole life being told that her existence was a problem to be managed. And now the people of the walls were cheering for her, calling her their queen, looking at her with an adoration that was in some ways structurally identical to the way the cadets in training had worshipped Crystal Lens. The vessel was different, the contents were different, but the shape of other people projecting their needs onto her remained the same, and she was going to have to spend whatever came next figuring out how to be a person inside that projection rather than simply becoming it. She opened an orphanage. She spent her days among children who had been left behind by a world that did not have room for them, giving them what she had never been given, which was simply the experience of being chosen. She had been born a secret and raised as an apology and named after a costume, and she had carried every one of those things across years of survival and emerged as something the story had not particularly promised her she would get to become.
A person.
Her own person. Someone with a real name and a real face, and the slowly accumulating knowledge that those things had always been hers, underneath everything, waiting for a moment she was finally allowed to claim them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Historia's journey from hidden name to crowned queen is one of the most complete character arcs in the series, a girl taught to erase herself who eventually refused to. Next, we turn to the soldiers who took Aaron's vision and turned it into a movement, and what happens when loyalty to one person becomes something far more dangerous than loyalty. Section 7. Flock and the Jaegerist, loyalty turned fanaticism. Pay attention to who Flock Forster was before the Battle of Shiganshina, because it matters for understanding what he became after it. He was not someone the story flagged as exceptional. He was one of a large group of new Survey Corps recruits who had transferred in from the garrison, ordinary soldiers trying to build a place for themselves in an organization already populated with people who had survived years of extraordinary circumstances. He was not particularly brave. He was not particularly skilled. During the feast that preceded the expedition to retake Shiganshina, he sat with his fellow recruits and asked Jean, with the kind of wry anxiety that belongs to people who know they are about to do something they might not survive, whether soldiers from his background were really considered reliable enough for what was coming. It was a very human thing to wonder. What followed was a battle that the Survey Corps almost did not survive at all. Erwin Smith led a suicide charge against the Beast Titan on the plains outside Shiganshina, taking every surviving recruit with him directly into the bombardment. The plan was stark and deliberate. The recruits would serve as the distraction. Their deaths would draw Zeke's attention long enough for Levi to close the distance and attack, and the operation would succeed because enough people were willing to die for it to work. Erwin gave a speech before they moved. He was honest about what they were doing. He was honest about the fact that most of them would not come back, and then they charged because that was what the situation required. And because Erwin was the kind of commander who could make people charge towards certain death by the force of his own willingness to go with them. All of them were killed except one. Flock survived. Not because he did anything particular to survive, but because the geometry of the bombardment and the trajectory of the rocks and the specific place he happened to be standing. In the moment the boulders fell, all conspired to leave him standing when everyone around him was gone. He searched the field afterward and found Erwin barely alive and brought him back. He was there when Levi made the choice to give the Titan serum to Armin rather than to Erwin. He watched Erwin die. He said, in the aftermath, that he thought Erwin should have been saved. That Erwin was the kind of person capable of carrying the weight of what needed to be done without flinching. That Armin was someone too gentle for the world that was coming. He said this harshly and at the wrong time and in a way that was genuinely unkind to Armin and Mikasa. He was right that it was the wrong moment. He was also in a painful way asking a real question. That moment at Shiganshina is the hinge of Flock's entire arc. A person who had previously been afraid, who had hesitated during the charge and nearly broken before going forward anyway, who had survived when none of his fellow recruits did, arrived on the other side of the battle with a specific new understanding of the world. Survival, when it comes to you while everyone around you dies, does not usually feel like luck. It tends to feel like meaning. The mind reaches for a reason, because the alternative, that it was random and that those who died were simply in the wrong place, and he was simply in the right one, is too empty to carry forward into a life. Flock did not reach for luck. He reached for purpose. He decided he had survived because he was the kind of person who could see things clearly. He decided Irwin had been right, and that the world required someone capable of doing terrible things in service of survival, and that this clarity, this willingness to accept necessary evil without flinching, was what distinguished the people who could actually save Parody from the people who were too emotionally compromised to do what needed doing. He appointed himself among the first group. He spent the next 4 years building himself into the version of that person that his own framework demanded. Aaron told him the truth about the rumbling before the attack on Liberio. This is one of the things the story reveals late and quietly, that Flock was among the very small number of people who knew, ahead of everyone else, what Aaron was actually planning. Not Zeke's euthanasia plan, which Aaron was using as cover. The real plan? The rumbling. Millions of colossal titans walking across the continent until there was nothing left of every military power that threatened Paradis. Flock heard this and believed it was necessary. He believed it was the only thing that would actually work, and he went to Liberio with that knowledge in his hands and fought alongside people who did not have it, who believed they were there for a different reason entirely. When they came back to Paradis and Aaron was arrested by the military, Flock organized. He was methodical about it in a way that his earlier self, the frightened recruit on the eve of Shiganshina, would not have been. He identified soldiers in the Survey Corps and the garrison and the military police who were unhappy with the old order, who felt that the diplomatic approach being pursued by the military leadership was naive given what the outside world had made clear it intended to do to Paradis. He talked to them. He built relationship. He constructed quietly and without announcing it, a parallel faction inside the existing military structure. The Jaegerists who emerged from that organizing were not a uniform group. Some of them were ideologically committed in the way Flock was. People who had thought about the situation of Paradis Island at length and arrived at the conclusion that survival required the rumbling, and that anyone opposed to it was choosing the world over their own people. Others were less certain of the ideology and more certain of Flock himself. Soldiers who trusted his read on the situation because he had survived Shiganshina and seemed to understand things that were not easily explained. Others still joined because the Jaegerists were acquiring power, and power has a way of attracting people who have decided that being on the right side of it is more important than examining what the right side is actually doing. Louise was among the younger recruits. She had seen Aaron transform as a titan during the Battle of Trost years earlier, as a child watching from the crowd, and that image had fixed itself in her the way formative images sometimes do, not as something to analyze, but as something to organize a self around. She idolized Aaron with the specific intensity of someone who has decided that another person embodies what they most want to be, and that kind of devotion does not leave much room for the ordinary skepticism that might otherwise pump the brakes. She joined the Jaegerists young and went further than most of them did and died for it, and her last words were that she had no regrets. She meant it. The story does not soften that fact or make it more comfortable than it is. The tactics the Jaegerists used to seize control of the Paradis military were not gentle. They assassinated Commander Darius Zackley with a bomb planted in his office chair. They distributed wine to the senior military leadership that had been laced with Zeke's spinal fluid, which carried the ability to transform the drinkers into pure titans the moment Zeke used his scream. This held the entire command structure of Paradis hostage without a single shot had to be fired. The people who drank the wine could either cooperate or be transformed into monsters, and both options were now entirely within the Jaegerist's control to decide. Jean nearly drank it. He was saved only by timing and proximity to people who knew what was in the glass. The takeover of Paradis was swift and comprehensive. The military loyalists, which included Hange and Levi and Armin, and the rest of the people who had spent years fighting for exactly the population the Jaegerists claimed to be protecting, were declared renegades and arrested. Flock stood in front of them in the aftermath with the quiet confidence of someone who has spent years building toward a moment and has finally arrived at it. He told them that the Eldian Empire was going to be reborn. He told them that Aaron was the only one capable of making it happen. He held public executions. He forced new cadets to beat their instructors as demonstrations of loyalty. He did all of this with the same unshakable conviction he had carried since the plains outside Shiganshina, the certainty that he understood what survival required, and that anyone who could not face that understanding was simply not yet ready to face the world honestly. The thing that makes Flock genuinely difficult to dismiss as simply a villain is that some of what he understood was real. The world outside Paradis did want Eldians destroyed. The diplomatic approaches being attempted by the Survey Corps leadership were being met with indifference from nations who had already decided what they intended to do. The fear that drove ordinary soldiers into the Jaegerists was not invented. It was reasonable, given everything they had learned, to believe that Paradis would be annihilated unless something drastic happened first. Flock had felt the specific terror of being the only survivor of a suicide charge, and that terror had converted into the only framework that made the aftermath bearable, which was the framework that said his survival meant something and that he was the kind of person capable of doing what others would not. The ideology followed from the womb. Most extremist convictions do, but conviction, no matter how sincerely held, does not make the things done in its name the right things. The Jaegerists tortured people. They killed people who had not chosen a side. They held an entire military command under threat of transformation into mindless titans. They celebrated the beginning of the rumbling, which was the systematic destruction of most of the human life on the planet, with a fervor that the story deliberately presents as disturbing even to people who had agreed with their earlier action. Jean and Connie, who had both been caught in the gravitational pull of Aaron's choices, looked at that celebration and felt something shift in them that would eventually become the decision to try to stop the rumbling rather than let it finish. Flock died at the harbor, clinging to the hull of a boat with a wound that should have already killed him, reaching up to fire a shot that might have stopped the flying boat from taking off and reaching Aaron. Mikasa shot him. He fell into the water. His last words were still an appeal, still a plea to Ji and Hanj not to go, still organized around the single conviction that had replaced everything else in him after Shiganshina. He believed, to the last breath, that he was the one who understood what survival required. He was not entirely wrong about the situation. He was entirely wrong about what it justified. That distinction is the thing the Jaegerists as a whole illuminate about the larger story. Attack on Titan is full of people who are right about the problem and catastrophically wrong about the solution. The Jaegerists represent the endpoint of what happens when loyalty to a person or to an idea someone represents is taken past the point where it can be examined critically. They were not villains in the way cartoons have villains. They were soldiers who had survived things that broke the ordinary architecture of their judgment and who rebuilt that architecture around a single fixed point, and who followed that point all the way to the harbor. Flock was, at the end, exactly the devil he had always believed the situation required. He just forgot to ask whether that devil was pointing in the right direction. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Jaegerists show what happens when ordinary people stop questioning the cause they have given themselves to. Next, we pull back further into the history of Paradis itself, to a man who operated in the shadows of the military for years, whose loyalty was always to something smaller and more personal than any of the causes around him, and whose story sits at the heart of the Ackerman bloodline itself. Section 8. Kenny Ackerman, the uncle who left the underground city, sits beneath the capital of Mitras, below the innermost wall, below the streets where the wealthy and the powerful live in the comfortable ignorance of a society that has decided some people belong above ground, and some people belong below it. It is not a metaphor the story makes explicit. It simply exists as the place where the people the walls have no use for end up, where poverty and crime, and the particular kind of desperation that comes from having no legitimate path upward accumulates in the dark. Levi Ackerman was born there, to a mother named Kushal, who worked as a prostitute and loved her son as completely as her circumstances allowed, which was not always enough to change what his circumstances were. Kenny Ackerman found them after Kuchel died. He had not visited in some time. He knew what his sister was doing to survive, and he had complicated feelings about it that the story does not fully explain, which is appropriate because Kenny himself probably could not have fully. He arrived at the brothel and found Kuchel dead and a small, starved boy sitting beside her bed in the dark, not quite understanding what had happened or what came next. Kenny stood there for a moment, looking at this child who was his blood and who had no one else in the world, and made a decision that surprised himself probably as much as it would have surprised anyone who knew him. He stayed, not because he was the kind of person who stayed. Kenny the Ripper was not, by any standard accounting, a person oriented toward care or responsibility or the slower rhythms of a life organized around someone else's needs. He had earned his reputation, honestly, as an urban legend who had managed to kill over 100 military police officers and remain not just alive, but free, someone the capital treated as a story told to frighten the ambitious rather than a real threat to be managed. He operated in the shadows of the underground and the corridors of the capital with equal fluency, and he had done so for years without anyone he cared about enough to significantly alter his plans. He was, in the vocabulary of his world, a free man, which meant a man accountable to no one and nothing except whatever he decided to pursue next. He raised Levi anyway. He taught him to fight with a knife, the specific economical style that came naturally to someone who had grown up in environments where the weapons available were never going to be ideal, and the margin for error was always small. He taught him how to navigate the social dynamics of the underground, how to read a room, how to identify the people in it who were going to cause problems before they actually caused them. He was not gentle about any of it. Gentleness was not in Kenny's repertoire, and forcing it would have produced something false that would not have served Levi in the environment he was going to have to survive. He gave the boy what he actually needed, which was the knowledge and the capability to still be alive after the people around him tried to ensure otherwise. Then he left. He did not tell Levi he was leaving. He did not explain why. He waited until he assessed that Levi had reached the point where he could manage without him, which by his own account was the only justification for leaving that he could construct, and then he walked away. He did not reveal that he was Levi's uncle. He had introduced himself to Levi as a friend of Kuchel's rather than as her brother, and that distance was deliberate, a barrier he maintained across the whole of the time they lived together. He was present and he was useful and he was genuinely responsible for Levi being alive and capable. He was also, in the most fundamental way, absent the entire time, because the thing Levi needed from him and never got was not the knife technique or the street knowledge. It was the acknowledgement that they were family and that this mattered. Kenny believed he was not fit to be a father. He said this to Levi in the moment just before he died, leaning against a tree outside the collapsed chapel, crushed by debris from Rod Riss's Titan transformation and bleeding in a way that was clearly not going to stop. He said it plainly, not as an apology exactly, more as an account. He was not the kind of person who made good apologies, because he was not the kind of person who fully accepted the premise that his choices had owed anyone an apology. He stated the reason he left as a fact about himself rather than a wound in Levi, which is its own kind of honesty, even if it was the wrong kind delivered far too late. Before any of that, before the dying and the revelation and the quiet confession under the trees, there was Uri Rice. Kenny had grown up knowing something that most people inside the walls were never allowed to know. His grandfather had told him about the Ackerman clan's history, about a bloodline of warriors who served the royal family of Eldia for generations, protecting the holders of the Founding Titan in exchange for the specific protection that kind of proximity to power offered. The Ackermans had been loyal beyond what most loyalties endure, and the first king, Karl Fritz, had repaid that loyalty by issuing a purge. He erased the memories of the subjects of Ymir who lived inside the walls, but the Ackermans were not subjects of Ymir, and the memory erasure did not reach them. They remembered. They kept remembering, which made them dangerous to a government that had structured its entire authority on the premise that the people within the walls did not know what they had been made to forget. The persecution drove the Ackerman clan to near extinction over the generations that followed. Most of them died. A few survived in hiding. Kenny grew up carrying this history without a clear idea of what to do with it except resent it, which he did, efficiently and comprehensively. He tracked down Uri Reis, the hidden true king of Eldia, the holder of the Founding Titan, with the intention of killing him. He believed that if anyone was owed a reckoning for what had been done to his bloodline, it was the man at the top of the system that had ordered it. He found Uri. He had the opportunity. And Uri did something that Kenny's entire framework for how the world operated had not prepared him. Uri knelt. He went down on his knees in front of the man who had come to kill him, and he apologized. Not defensively, not strategically, not in the way that powerful people apologize when they have calculated that contrition is the most efficient path to safety. He apologized as someone who genuinely understood that a wrong had been done, and that he was the inheritor of the institution that had done it, and who felt the weight of that inheritance as a real thing rather than an abstract historical problem. He said Kenny's anger was justified. He said he could not die right then, but he said it as a fact about the situation rather than a claim about his own importance. He asked Kenny to spare him. Kenny had never encountered someone stronger than himself, who then declined to use that strength to compel obedience. He had built his entire understanding of power around the principle that people with more of it made people with less of it do what they wanted, and people with less of it either submitted or found a clever way around. Uri had the Founding Titan, which was the most power available anywhere inside the walls, and he was on his knees asking. That was so far outside the architecture of Kenny's world that it produced something in him that he was not equipped to label cleanly. He called it later, in different ways, in different conversations, a fascination, something approaching respect, the specific unsettlement of realizing that the person in front of you operates by rules you did not know existed. He chose to serve Uri, not because Uri had compelled him to, but because he genuinely wanted to understand what made a person like that, what it would feel like to have that kind of power and choose to kneel with it instead of wielding it. He became Uri's bodyguard, and then his friend, and the friendship was real, in the way that relationships between very different people can be real when each of them sees something in the other that they cannot find anywhere. Uri stopped the persecution of the Ackerman clan. That was not nothing, but it was also not the main reason Kenny stayed. The main reason was that he had found someone who baffled him in a way he wanted to keep being baffled by. He served Uri until Uri died and passed the Founding Titan to Frida Rice. And in Frida, looking at the same expressions and the same quality of presence he had recognized in Uri, Kenny understood what the Founding Titan did to its holders. It carried something with it, some philosophical weight, some accumulated worldview from the first king who had decided that humanity needed to be controlled for its own good. Uri had been shaped by it. Frida was being shaped by it. And Kenny, watching from his position as enforcer and loyal functionary, developed a question that began to displace the grief of losing Uri entirely. If he held the founding titan, would he understand what Uri had understood? Would he feel what Uri had felt? That quality of knowing the world fully enough to kneel in front of an enemy and mean it. He could not let the question go. He told himself he wanted power, which was a simpler explanation and that required less uncomfortable self-examination. But what he actually wanted was comprehension. He had spent his life organized around the principle that the strong do what they want and the weak accept what they are given. And Uri had contradicted that principle so completely that Kenny had never been able to fully rebuild his worldview afterward. He wanted to know if holding the same power would give him access to the same perspective, the same capacity for whatever Uri had been capable of. He spent years inside the military police, working toward the moment when he might be able to claim the founding titan for himself. He recruited and trained the Anti-Personnel Control Squad, the unit specifically designed to fight human soldiers rather than titans, equipped with vertical maneuvering gear and firearms adapted for close-quarters combat against Survey Corps members. He became the instrument of a government he did not respect, managed people he had no genuine loyalty to, and maintained the long game of a person who has decided that patience is the cost of getting to something worth having. When the moment came, in the cavern beneath the Rice Chapel, with Aaron chained and Rod preparing to give Historia the syringe and the whole plan for the founding titans transfer in progress, Kenny overheard Rod say something that closed the door on everything he had been working to. The founding titans' full power could only be realized by a member of the Rice family. He was an Ackerman. The power he had spent years maneuvering toward was simply not accessible. The question he had lived inside for decades had no answer available to him through the path he had been walking. He turned against Rod in that moment with the efficiency of someone who has nothing left to protect in the current arrangement. He took the Titan serum from Rod's bag before the cave collapsed. He was buried under the debris when Rod transformed into his grotesque, enormous Titan form and the stone above them came down. He survived, barely, and made it outside to a tree where he leaned and accepted that he was dying, and waited to see if Levi would find him before it was finished. Levi found him. They talked. Kenny gave him the serum. He told Levi that he was not fit to be a father. He told Levi what he was to Kuchel, which was her brother, which made him Levi's uncle, which Levi received with the specific expression of someone who has suspected something and is now having it confirmed too late for the knowledge to change anything substantial. He watched Levi absorb it. He did not offer an extended explanation of why he had waited this long because there was not a good one. He had made the choice he made, and he had lived inside it for years, and it had produced what it produced. In his last moments, he said something that stayed. He said, everyone is drunk on something. Everyone finds something to lean on to keep going, some belief or some person or some cause or some hunger, and that thing becomes the organizing principle of the life around it. He had been drunk on strength, and then on Uri, and then on the question of what Uri's power would have felt like from the inside. The thing he had been chasing across his whole life was not the founding titan. It was the feeling of understanding something completely, the way Uri had seemed to understand it, the way powerful people who kneel in front of their enemies instead of destroying them must understand. Something that people like Kenny never quite managed to read. He had served a family he did not fully believe in, betrayed the interest of the people he was supposed to protect, abandoned his only nephew without a word, and spent the last years of his life pursuing a power that was never going to be available to him. He died, leaning against a tree in the daylight, having given away the one thing he had actually managed to take from the wreckage, which was the serum in his hand. Levi sat with him until it was done and said nothing that was recorded. He did not need to say anything. Kenny already knew everything Levi would have said, because he had raised him well enough to know exactly what kind of man Levi had become, which was not the kind of man Kenny had been. And that was probably the best thing Kenny ever did, even though he left before he got to see it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Kenny spent his whole life chasing something he could never quite name, and left behind the one person who might have given him a reason to stop chasing. Next, we pull back further still, to the warriors themselves, and to the question of what betrayal even means when the people doing the betraying were never truly free to choose otherwise. Section 9. The Warriors. Children who were never given a choice begin with a parade. In the city of Liberio, in the internment zone where Eldians lived under Marleyan supervision, children selected as warrior candidates were paraded through the streets in horse-drawn carriages before departing on their missions. They wore their uniforms and waved to crowds who had gathered to celebrate. They were called the Defenders of the World, the hope of the nation, the brave souls who would carry Marley's power into the future. People threw flowers, people cheered, and the children in those carriages, somewhere between 9 and 17 years old, depending on the year and the mission, absorbed the cheering and tried to feel what they were being told they should feel, which was pride, which was purpose, which was the particular warmth of being chosen. They had been chosen in the most literal possible sense. The warrior program had recruited them from their families between the ages of 5 and 7, assessed their physical capabilities and their capacity for obedience and their bloodline, and selected the ones who showed the most promise for a future that would be spent in service to a nation that would never fully accept them as citizens. Eldians were not Marleys. They lived in the internment zone and wore armbands and were taught from the moment they could hold a thought that their ancestors had been the devils of the earth, that the Titan powers the Eldian people carried were the source of a century of atrocity, that the only way an Eldian could earn something approximating dignity was to place that power in service of the nation that had conquered them. The children believed it. Most of them believed it completely and honestly because they had been taught nothing else and had no access to anything that would complicate what they were taught, and because the human mind at 6 years old is not yet equipped to locate the self-interested architecture of a propaganda system designed specifically for it. They were not stupid, they were children. There is a meaningful difference. Reiner Braun wanted to be a warrior from the earliest age the story visits him. He was half Marleyan on his father's side, which placed him in the particularly unstable position of having blood from both groups in a world that had decided those groups were fundamentally opposed. His father had left the family. The absence was not politically neutral in the context of Marleyan society. Reiner grew up with his mother, Karina, who channeled every aspiration she had for the family's future into the warrior program, with the focused intensity of someone who has decided that this one path is the only path available. She told him that becoming a warrior would restore the family's honor. She told him that if he succeeded, his father might acknowledge him. She built the program into the shape of a rescue, and Reiner accepted that shape entirely because it gave him a framework for the longing he already carried. He was not the strongest candidate. Marcel Galliard was stronger, more technically gifted, more obviously suited to the demands of the selection. Porco Galliard, Marcel's younger brother, was talented enough to have been considered for the Armored Titan before the process concluded. But Marcel, in a moment that the story reveals only much later, and through the memories that Titan inheritance carries between holders, had quietly intervened. He had spoken to the assessors and recommended Reiner over his brother. He had done this not because he thought Reiner deserved it more, but because he looked at his brother and understood what becoming a warrior would cost, and did not want that cost paid by Porco if he could redirect. He gave Reiner the Armored Titan and the mission to Paradis, knowing what awaited there. He told Reiner on the day of departure that he was sorry for having put him in this position. Marcel was eaten by Ymir on the shore before the mission truly began. He saved Reiner's life in his final seconds, pushing him out of the path of a charging pure Titan and dying in his place, which was both a final act of protection and a complete closure on the apology he had just offered. Reiner was left on the shore of Paradis Island with Annie and Bertolt, without the leader who was supposed to guide the mission, without a clear sense of whether to go forward or go back, and with the specific bewilderment of someone who has just watched a person die saving them and has not yet processed what that means for everything they were supposed to do next. They went forward because going forward was what they had been made to do, and because there was no framework available to them for the alternative. What the years inside the walls did to Reiner is one of the most precise psychological portraits in the entire series. He did not simply maintain a cover identity. He did not keep the warrior persona in a sealed compartment while the soldier persona operated in public. The two began to merge in a way that produced something the story treats with clinical accuracy as a genuine fracturing. Soldier Reiner and Warrior Reiner stopped being a controlled performance and became something more involuntary, two versions of the same person competing for the governing position inside a mind that could not sustain both simultaneously. He made friends. He meant the friendship. He saved people and was saved by them and shared meals with them, and was called the big brother of his cadet cohort because the warmth he showed them was not entirely performed. He had absorbed so much of what those people were that extracting himself from them had become genuinely impossible, which is precisely what made his confession on the wall in Season 2 so strange in its delivery. He told Eren that he was the Armored Titan almost casually, as if the words had escaped before the governing personality could stop them, because in some real sense they had. He was not operating from a coherent strategic decision when he spoke. He was operating from a mind that had fractured under the sustained pressure of being two people, and the fracture expressed itself as a confession delivered in a manner completely mismatched to its content. Bertolt, watching from a short distance away, knew something terrible was happening before Eren fully processed what had been said. Bertolt carried his own version of this without the visible fracturing. He was quieter about his suffering, which made it less immediately legible but no less real. He knew what he had done on the day Wall Maria fell. He had stood at the top of that gate as the colossal Titan, and he had kicked a hole in the structure that had kept people safe for over a century, and people had died in the chaos of what followed, including Eren's mother, and Bertolt had known this, and had kept training alongside those people, and had kept eating beside them, and kept existing inside their trust for Years. He did not dissociate from this knowledge the way Reiner dissociated. He held it in a quiet place where it made him slightly too still in rooms that called for animation, slightly too careful in conversations that called for. He developed feelings for Annie that he never acted on and never adequately expressed, and the specific privacy of that affection belongs to the portrait of a person who has learned to keep the things that matter most to him below the surface where they cannot be used against him. Annie's version of the same experience was different again, shaped by the particular coldness she had developed as the only available protection against a childhood that had taught her love was transactional. She looked at the people in the walls and did not form the same attachments Reiner formed, partly because she had less practice with attachment and partly because she had been very clear with herself from the moment she arrived that this was a mission rather than a life. She saved Armin during the 57th expedition because she recognized his face and was not willing to kill someone. She recognized that small moment of recognition, that unwillingness to destroy the specific human rather than the abstracted enemy, was the thread that pulled at her cover until Armin used it to confirm what he had suspected. She did not regret going back for Armin. She would not have done it differently. The attachment, small as it was, had been real. Marcel had seen all of this coming in, the way that people sometimes see clearly what will happen to others while remaining unable to prevent it. He had understood that the mission to Paradise was going to do terrible things to whoever went on it, and he had tried to redirect his brother away from that fate, and had ended up caught in it himself and died in the first minutes of the operation. What he could not know, because no one could have known, was that his attempt to protect Porco from the mission would eventually fail anyway, that Porco would inherit the Jaw Titan from Ymir and carry his brother's memories inside him, and spend years resenting Reiner for perceived theft that had actually been an act of brotherly protection. The story withholds this detail until the final season, in the moment when Porco is dying and finally receives the memory of Marcel telling Reiner what he had done and why. Porco learned the truth in the same moment he was too badly wounded to act on anything it changed. There is a recurring structural element in the warriors' stories that is worth sitting with, which is that none of the information that might have changed their choices arrived when it could have changed them. Marcel learned what Titan inheritance actually costs and tried to protect his brother from it too late. Reiner and Bertolt arrived on Paradis, having absorbed the propaganda so completely that the reality of the people they were supposed to regard as enemies only started breaking through after years of proximity, by which point the mission had already produced casualties that could not be undone. Porco learned what his brother had done for him while he was dying. The pattern is not accidental. The system that produced the warriors was specifically designed to ensure that the information capable of producing doubt arrived after the actions that doubt might have prevented had already been taken. This is what Marley's warrior program actually was, beneath the parades and the uniforms and the rhetoric about defenders of the world. It was a system for converting children into weapons by ensuring they never had enough information to consent to what they were becoming. It took the love of families, the specific anxiety of parents who wanted better circumstances for their children, the genuine desire of young people to matter and belong, and it channeled all of those real and legitimate human needs into the service of a geopolitical project those children could not understand at 5 years old and would not be allowed to fully examine until they were already committed. Gabby Braun, Reiner's younger cousin, was moving through the same pipeline in Season 4, bright and devoted and capable and completely sincere in her belief that the Eldians of Paradis deserved what was coming to them. She had been taught this the same way Reiner had been taught it. She believed it with the full force of someone who has been shaped since early childhood to believe it, and who has never encountered anything that successfully complicated that from the outside. She shot Sasha. She did not know Sasha. She knew that Sasha was a soldier from Paradis who had been part of an attack on Liberio, and in the framework she had been given, that was sufficient information to act on. What she encountered afterward, in the months spent inside the walls and among the people she had been taught, were devils, began to do to her what years in the Survey Corps had done to Reiner, which was introduce her to people as people rather than as abstraction, and discover that the abstraction does not survive sustained contact with the particular human underneath it. The warriors were not innocent in the way that removes responsibility entirely. Reiner made decisions. Annie made decisions. Bertolt knew what he had done and continued doing it. The deaths were real and the harm was real, and the people who died did not die any less because the people who killed them had been shaped by forces larger than themselves. But the story refuses the easier reading, which is to locate the source of all of this in the warriors themselves and leave it there. The source was the system. The system recruited children. The children were given a mission and a framework and a uniform and a parade and the specific satisfaction of being chosen, and then they were pointed at other people and told to destroy them. And the only thing the story insists on is that you hold the system and the individual in the same frame without letting one cancel out the other, because that is the only honest way to look at what betrayal means when the people doing the betraying were never, not from the very beginning, given the chance to decide for themselves who they wanted to be. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The warriors were shaped into weapons before they were old enough to question the shaping. Next, we arrive at the final and largest betrayal in the entire series, the one that was not aimed at a single person or a single institution, but at the world itself and what the end of the story asks us to do with everything we have watched. Section 10. The Rumbling. When the world learned what Eren decided, the walls had been standing for over a century. From the inside, they were simply the boundary of the known world. People were born inside them, grew up inside them, and died inside them, having never seen what lay beyond. The walls held the sky above and the fields beside and the cities within, and as long as they held, everything continued. Most people never questioned that. The shape of the world was the shape of the walls, and that was enough. They were also full of people, not metaphorically. Embedded inside the stone of each wall stood an enormous number of colossal titans, immobilized by hardening, placed there by the first king as both building material and deterrent. If any nation threatened Paradise, the king could release them. The threat had worked for over a century because everyone capable of testing it had decided not to. Eren Yeager tested it. When the founding titan's power connected with Zeke's royal blood at Shiganshina, the walls simply came apart. The colossal titans stepped free simultaneously, the hardening dissolving at Eren's command, the stone collapsing behind them. There were hundreds of thousands of them. They turned toward the horizon and began to walk, and the sound of their walking shook the ground for miles in every direction. The steam they produced rose in columns wide enough to change the color of the sky. They walked south, they crossed the island, they reached the ocean. They kept walking. Approximately 80% of all human life on the planet was ended over the course of 4 days. Before it reached Marley, Eren had already known what the rumbling would consume. He had seen it. During the Survey Corps' covert visit to Marley in the year before the attack on Liberio, he had encountered a boy named Ramzi in a refugee camp, a child saving coins in a hidden bag because he believed that when it was full, everyone in the camp could live somewhere better. Eren sat with him and wept. He apologized in words Ramzi could not understand. He had already seen this child's face in the memories of what was coming, and he sat there knowing it and did not change what he planned to do. Ramzi died under the rumbling. The bag was still not full. Inside the vast mental space of the Founding Titan's awareness, Eren floated above the destruction he had released. He had constructed careful reasons for why this was necessary. He had believed those reasons sincerely across the years of building toward this moment. But in that space, with the full scale of what he had done visible all at once, something else surfaced that he could not organize into justification. He had wanted this, not only the strategic outcome, the destruction itself. The world beyond the walls had looked nothing like the pictures in Armin's book, and what that discovery had produced in him was something he could not fully name, a pull toward the clean blank space of a world swept free of the thing that had disappointed him when he finally saw it. He did not tell his friends this, not entirely. What he told Armin in the paths, in the conversation Armin would not remember until after everything was finished, was the version that was true but not complete. He had done it so they could live. He had planned for the rumbling to stop before the world was fully gone, because his friends would reach him and stop it, and that act would make them the heroes of a new history, the people who saved humanity from its own catastrophe. The tactical thinking was real. The love behind it was real. But underneath both of those things was the part he admitted only partially, the compulsion that had not been entirely produced by strategy. Armin told him they would meet in hell. He meant it as solidarity. Eren heard it that way. Mikasa climbed into the mouth of the Founding Titan and found him. She was the only one who could reach him, the only person his planning had never fully managed to push beyond the point of return. She had carried the weight of what he said to her at the restaurant across everything that followed. The words she knew were wrong and had to keep believing were wrong until this moment arrived. She found him inside the Titan's body. She kissed him. She cut off his head. The Titans fell across the world in the same instant, every one of them. The power of the Titans released at the moment of Eren's death. The curse of Ymir lifted. Ymir Fritz, who had waited 2,000 years in the space of the paths for someone to make Mikasa's choice, watched her make it and finally let go. What remained was the world, not a clean world, a world in which most of human life had been destroyed in 4 days, full of grief and ruin, and the bitterness of survivors trying to make sense of something that resisted it. The nations that remained gathered their militaries and pointed them at Paradis, because the people who stopped the rumbling were still Eldian, and the hatred had not dissolved simply because an Eldian had ended the thing another Eldian started. Armin stood before those forces and told them he was the man who killed Eren Yeager. That account became the fragile foundation of a peace the story does not pretend will hold for. Mikasa buried Eren's head beneath a tree where he had once fallen asleep as a child. A bird came to the graveside and touched the scarf he had placed around her shoulders when they were both small, and the world was still the size of Shiganshina. She stayed with that for a moment. Then she stood and walked away. The cycle had not ended. The world was changed and also continuous. People were still afraid. Nations were still building weapons, but the Titans were gone, And somewhere in that fact was the smallest possible version of what Aaron had wanted when he was a boy listening to Armin describe the ocean. He had just wanted the world to be worth the size of the freedom he had always believed was waiting inside it. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe and I'll see you in the next video.